Ava Collins stepped out of the clinic with one hand resting protectively on her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of the baby beneath her palm. The evening air was cool, the sky washed with soft shades of orange and purple, and for a moment she let herself breathe. The appointment had gone well, the doctor assuring her the baby was healthy and strong, and she clung to that comfort as she crossed the parking lot toward her car. But midway through the lot, something felt off. A strange stillness. A heaviness. It wasn't until she reached her parking spot that her steps slowed and her breath caught in her throat. Her car, her only means of getting around, looked like it had been dragged through a battlefield. The windows were shattered into glittering piles on the ground, the tires sliced open like ribbons, and long, angry scratch marks scarred the paint. Ava stood frozen, a wave of disbelief washing over her, followed immediately by a sharp spike of fear. Then she saw her. Leaning casually against the rear end of the ruined car, arms folded, lips curled in a cruel smirk, Sabrina Hayes. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, her red lipstick painfully bright against her pale skin, and in her right hand she held a metal rod, swinging it lightly as if it were nothing more than a toy. Their eyes met, and Sabrina's smirk widened, cold and victorious, as though she were proud of the destruction she had caused. Ava's pulse quickened. Sabrina wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to know where she'd be. And yet here she was, standing like a warning in human form. Before Ava could say a word, another car pulled into the lot. Ethan Collins stepped out, adjusting his tie, pretending to be surprised when he saw the damage. "Ava? What happened?" he asked, but his eyes flickered toward Sabrina for just a second, just long enough for Ava to notice. His voice trembled with fake concern, and guilt radiated off him like heat. Ava's heart sank. Fear, betrayal, and danger collided inside her all at once, leaving her breathless and trembling as she realized this wasn't a random attack. This was personal. This was a message. And she was standing right in the middle of it. Sabrina Hayes had always worn her confidence like her signature red lipstick, bold, bright, and meant to be noticed. But beneath the polished exterior burned something far darker, an obsession that had grown like a wildfire ever since she first laid eyes on Ethan Collins. From the beginning, jealousy wrapped itself around her like a second skin, pulling her deeper into a fantasy where Ethan belonged to her alone. She didn't just want him, she wanted to replace Ava entirely, erase her existence, and step into her life as if it were a role she had been born to play. Every time she saw the softness in Ethan's eyes when he talked about Ava, a vicious envy gnawed at her, convincing her she deserved his attention more than his pregnant wife ever could. The flashbacks played like a twisted reel in Sabrina's mind. She remembered the night it all began, Ethan frustrated after an argument with Ava, sitting alone at a quiet bar. She had slid onto the stool beside him with a knowing smile, pretending it was coincidence. She complimented him, told him he looked too handsome to be sitting alone, and gently coaxed his insecurities to the surface. When he confessed he felt unseen and unappreciated, Sabrina had leaned in closer, whispering that she saw him, understood him. It was easy to feed his ego. Men like Ethan always fell for well-timed admiration. One touch on his arm, one flirtatious laugh, and he was hooked. From that night on, Sabrina made sure he felt constantly desired, constantly praised, something Ava, in Sabrina's mind, could never provide. But admiration turned into hunger, and hunger twisted into delusion. Sabrina convinced herself Ethan would choose her if she pushed hard enough. Destroying Ava's car wasn't just an act of rage, it was a calculated step in her obsession-driven plan. She believed that if Ava felt unsafe, overwhelmed, or humiliated, Ethan would run into Sabrina's arms for comfort. She believed she was doing him a favor, removing a weak link from his life. Her entitlement ran so deep she didn't see anything wrong with terrorizing a pregnant woman. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was the rightful choice. And if Ethan didn't realize that on his own, she was perfectly willing to force the decision for him. Ava didn't learn the truth in a dramatic moment, she overheard it by accident. The day after her car was destroyed, she sat in her living room, hands trembling as she replayed the scene in her head. Ethan paced back and forth, pretending to be stressed, pretending to care, but the cracks in his facade were widening. When his phone buzzed and he stepped aside to answer it, he assumed Ava couldn't hear him. But she did. "Sabrina, calm down," he whispered urgently. "Your father won't let anything happen. You're the commissioner's daughter, just stay quiet." The words hit Ava like a punch to the chest. Commissioner? As in Commissioner Richard Hayes? A man powerful enough to make or break investigations with a single phone call? Suddenly everything made sense, the boldness, the smirk, the fearlessness. Sabrina hadn't just attacked her, she had done it knowing she could walk away without consequences. The realization filled Ava with a sickening dread. Sabrina wasn't just a jealous mistress, she was a woman raised with the kind of privilege that made her believe rules existed for everyone except her. People whispered stories about the commissioner's daughter in the city. Reports that magically disappeared. Fights she started but never faced punishment for. A trail of chaos left behind, always cleaned up by her father. Sabrina had grown up believing the world bent around her desires, and Ethan, in his weakness, had let himself be pulled into her gravity. Ethan had never told Ava about Sabrina's background, partly because he feared Ava would see how dangerous the situation truly was, and partly because he didn't want to admit what he had gotten involved with. He didn't want Ava to know he had entangled himself with someone whose family held enormous power. It was selfish, cowardly, and unforgivable. Flashbacks of Sabrina's childhood painted a clearer picture. A little girl who threw tantrums when she didn't get what she wanted. A teenager who manipulated teachers, classmates, and friends. A young woman who realized that one phone call from her father could erase any mistake she made. She had weaponized charm, power, and intimidation with expert precision. And now all of that was pointed directly at Ava. Ava understood in that moment that she wasn't just dealing with a jealous woman, she was dealing with someone who believed she was untouchable. And that made her even more dangerous. Ava waited until evening, giving herself time to calm the storm inside her, but the moment Ethan walked through the door, looking exhausted and irritated rather than concerned, the words spilled out. She told him everything, Sabrina appearing at the clinic, the smirk, the metal rod, the destruction of the car. She expected shock, maybe anger, maybe even guilt from him. But Ethan barely reacted. Instead, he rubbed his temples, sighed dramatically, and muttered, "Ava, you really need to stop letting your pregnancy hormones mess with your head." The sentence hung in the air like poison. Ava stared at him, disbelief spreading slowly into her chest. Pregnancy hormones? She had stood face to face with Sabrina Hayes while her car lay in ruins, and all he could do was accuse her of being emotional. When she tried again, voice trembling, Ethan cut her off with a practiced calmness that felt rehearsed. He insisted she must have misunderstood the situation, that maybe the car had been vandalized randomly, that Sabrina had no reason to be there unless Ava was imagining things. His tone was smooth, his words deliberate, every sentence crafted to make Ava question her own perception. The realization hit her hard, this wasn't new. Ethan had been doing this for months. Every time she brought up his late nights, he blamed her sensitivity. Every time she felt him drifting, he dismissed it as her being overly emotional. He had been pushing her doubts aside for so long that she hadn't noticed how deeply she had started doubting herself. As she watched him move around the room, avoiding her eyes, Ava saw something she had ignored before. The distance. The coldness. The way he touched his phone more than he touched her. She remembered nights he came home smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, mornings when he left before she woke, conversations that ended with her feeling confused rather than reassured. The little cracks she once brushed away were now widening into chasms she couldn't unsee. For the first time, Ava looked at her marriage not as a home, but as a structure slowly collapsing around her. She wasn't losing Ethan, she had already lost him. And with each dismissive word he spoke, she realized the man standing in front of her wasn't her partner anymore. He was someone willing to let her drown just to keep his own secrets safe. Ava's life had slowly begun to feel like a minefield, each step carefully measured, each glance over her shoulder a reflex born of fear. Sabrina Hayes had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. It started subtly, messages on Ava's phone, innocent enough at first, pretending to be coincidences, "Saw you at the market, sweetie," or "I wonder who's driving that shiny new car." Then it escalated. Ava began receiving late-night texts filled with threats veiled as warnings: "Be careful where you park, and not everything in life goes as planned." Each message made her heart race, her palms sweat, and her stomach tighten with the anxiety of the unknown. But Ava refused to let Sabrina's intimidation go unnoticed. She downloaded apps, activated timestamps, and began recording every message, every interaction, every sign of harassment. Then came the day Sabrina showed up at the clinic. Ava was just finishing a routine appointment, hands gently resting on her growing belly, when she caught sight of the familiar figure leaning casually against the reception wall. Sabrina's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction, her red lipstick like a marker of defiance, her every movement calculated to provoke. She made no attempt to hide, and it was obvious she wanted Ava to see her, to feel fear, to understand that this wasn't a random encounter, it was deliberate. Ava's chest tightened, but she held her composure, pulling out her phone under the pretense of checking a message and pressing record. Every whispered word, every subtle threat, every smirk was captured, a silent testament to Sabrina's dangerous obsession. Over the following days, Sabrina's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was seen lingering near Ava's favorite cafe, watching her car from across the street, even following her on walks. Ava began documenting everything: times, locations, descriptions, knowing that the mounting evidence could protect her if something escalated further. Each encounter left Ava more anxious, but also more determined. The fear that had initially paralyzed her transformed into resolve. She knew she needed to confront the reality: Sabrina Hayes wasn't just a jealous mistress, she was dangerous, unpredictable, and utterly convinced that Ava's life was hers to control. And if left unchecked, the situation could spiral beyond anything Ava had prepared for. Ava's growing unease with Ethan had begun to take on sharper edges, and one evening, the faint scent of perfume on his shirt triggered a spark of suspicion she could no longer ignore. She started paying closer attention to his phone calls, his sudden disappearances, and the way his behavior changed when Sabrina Hayes was mentioned, even indirectly. What she discovered shattered any remaining illusions she had about her marriage. Ethan had been secretly taking money from Sabrina for months, money that she had lent under the guise of helping him with work expenses. At first, it seemed minor, almost trivial, but as Ava dug deeper, she realized the sums were significant, funneling into accounts she had never seen, hidden transactions designed to create leverage. Sabrina wasn't just obsessed, she was controlling, and Ethan had become a willing participant in her manipulation. Ethan's debt to Sabrina explained everything. Her smug confidence, her fearlessness, her ability to attack Ava without consequence, it wasn't just privilege, it was power over him. The more money he owed, the tighter her grip became. And Ethan, trapped by his own choices, allowed Sabrina to torment Ava. He didn't confront her, didn't protect his wife, because he feared confrontation with Sabrina and the reality of his dependence. Every argument he deflected, every excuse he gave, was a silent admission that he had lost his autonomy. The man Ava had married, the one she had trusted with her life and her babies, had been quietly betraying her, letting danger edge closer with every missed warning. Determined not to remain a victim, Ava began uncovering proof of their secret dealings. She accessed bank statements, saved messages, and documented irregularities in his finances. Each revelation was a blow, but also a tool, evidence that exposed Ethan's complicity and the dangerous triangle he had formed with Sabrina. She realized that control had been maintained through deception, not love, and that the house she called home had been quietly complicit in her harassment. Knowing now that Ethan's weakness had endangered her, Ava felt a surge of clarity. She would not rely on him. Every record she gathered became a step toward protecting herself and her unborn child, a silent declaration that she would reclaim the life Sabrina and Ethan had tried to control. Ava had expected at least some support from Margaret Collins, her mother-in-law, someone who had raised Ethan and presumably cared for her well-being. But the encounter left Ava stunned and more isolated than ever. When she cautiously approached Margaret about Sabrina's harassment, hoping for guidance or even a protective word, Margaret's reaction was the opposite of what she needed. She leaned back in her chair, expression cold, lips pressed into a tight line, and said, "Ava, you really need to learn your place. Sabrina is powerful, and you've been creating trouble where there isn't any. You should be careful what you provoke." The words struck Ava like icy daggers. Powerful? Margaret was implying that Sabrina's influence, and by extension her father's position, made Ava the one at fault. It was surreal, the audacity of her own family turning against her when danger was closing in. Ava's mind raced as she tried to process the betrayal. She had assumed family meant protection, at least moral support, but instead she faced blame and dismissal. The realization sank in, she couldn't count on anyone else to safeguard her or her unborn child. The very people who should have been allies were choosing the side of power over justice, of privilege over right. Margaret's cold lecture, combined with Ethan's complicity and Sabrina's aggression, left Ava with a suffocating sense of solitude. Fear tried to creep in, whispering that she was weak, that she was truly alone. Yet in that moment of isolation, something within Ava shifted. The fear that had gripped her began to transform into resolve. She would not allow herself to be coward, nor would she let anyone threaten the safety of her child. Margaret's indifference only strengthened her determination. If her own family wouldn't fight for her, she would fight for herself. Every strategy, every plan she would form, would send her on ensuring her baby's safety, her life's dignity, and reclaiming control over the chaos that Sabrina and Ethan had unleashed. Alone or not, Ava decided that she would become her own protector, her own shield, and her own voice, and nothing, not even the coldest betrayal, would stop her from keeping her child safe. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the police station, clutching the folder filled with photos, videos, and messages documenting Sabrina's harassment. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a harsh glow on the walls, and for a moment, she felt the weight of every step she had taken to get here. This was not just about her car anymore, it was about her safety, her dignity, and the well-being of her unborn child. She approached the front desk, took a deep breath, and calmly stated her purpose. "I want to file a complaint," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "My car was deliberately destroyed, and I've been threatened by a woman named Sabrina Hayes." The moment the name left her lips, the atmosphere shifted. The officers who had been typing and shuffling papers suddenly straightened, exchanged subtle glances, and one cleared his throat before asking, "Sabrina Hayes? Are you sure about this?" She's well connected. Her father is Commissioner Richard Hayes." Ava's heart sank, but she forced herself not to flinch. This was the intimidation she had feared, the very power Sabrina wielded, but she refused to back down. Another officer leaned in, lowering his voice. "We understand, ma'am, but sometimes situations like this, they can get complicated. Maybe it's better to reconsider. You don't want to create problems that could escalate." Ava's grip on her folder tightened, nails digging into the leather. She knew exactly what they were doing, trying to scare her into silence, to make her doubt her own courage. But she would not be swayed. "I am not reconsidering," she said, lifting her chin. "I am filing this complaint. I have proof. I will not be intimidated, and I will not be silenced. I want this investigated, and I want protection if necessary." Her voice, firm and unwavering, left no room for negotiation. The officers exchanged another glance, the weight of her determination making it clear that she was serious. Ava set the folder down on the desk and began presenting the evidence, one photograph, one message, one recording at a time. For the first time since the harassment began, she felt a spark of empowerment. Standing there, facing the system that had seemed intimidating, Ava realized that her courage might just be the weapon she needed to fight back. Sabrina's threats would not define her. She would take control of the situation, no matter who tried to stop her. Commissioner Richard Hayes sat in his office, the afternoon sunlight cutting through the blinds and falling across the polished mahogany desk. He was reviewing paperwork when a subordinate entered, looking uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. "Sir, there's a complaint," the officer said cautiously. "A woman named Ava Collins has reported your daughter, Sabrina. She claims harassment and property damage." Richard's hand froze mid-signature, his brow furrowing. His first thought wasn't of his daughter's behavior or the danger she had caused, it was the scandal. A public complaint involving the police commissioner's daughter could ruin reputations, compromise investigations, and become fodder for the media in ways he had spent decades avoiding. Protecting Sabrina had always been paramount, but now he realized the stakes had escalated beyond simple parental indulgence. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor, and paced the length of his office, mind racing. Sabrina had overstepped in ways even he could no longer control. And yet, fear of the exposure, of the scrutiny, burned hotter than his anger at her recklessness. When she arrived, expecting perhaps praise or indulgence for her antics, she found only a storm. Richard's voice cut through the air, sharp, cold, and unrelenting. "Sabrina. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know what this could mean? A complaint has been filed against you. Against my daughter. Against me." His eyes narrowed, voice icy. "I will not tolerate carelessness like this. You are jeopardizing everything I've worked for, everything we've built. Do you understand me?" Sabrina's confident facade faltered. The smirk, the casual posture, the air of untouchable entitlement, all evaporated under her father's scrutiny. For the first time, she felt the weight of consequence, the tangible threat of loss. Her mind began to spiral, a tangle of fear, anger, and desperation. She had relied on her father's influence for protection, for manipulation, for everything, but now, in his fury, she realized that power was not absolute. Her strategies, her threats, her harassment, everything she thought was untouchable was suddenly fragile. As Richard continued to berate her, pacing with measured fury, Sabrina felt panic creep in. She couldn't think clearly, couldn't plan her next move. The one constant she had counted on, her father's protection, was now a force she could no longer rely on. For the first time, the chaos she had created for Ava threatened to consume her own life, leaving her unmoored and dangerously unstable. Sabrina Hayes' control was slipping, her carefully constructed facade of confidence cracking at the edges. The confrontation with her father had shaken her deeply, leaving a fissure where certainty had once lived. Every look, every whisper, every sideways glance from strangers now felt like judgment. The world, once pliable and malleable under her influence, seemed suddenly threatening, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Her obsession with Ava Collins, which had always been dangerous, escalated into outright aggression. No longer satisfied with distant threats or subtle intimidation, she sought confrontation, a way to assert dominance before she herself felt overpowered. It all came to a head at the prenatal clinic. Ava was seated quietly in the waiting room, hands resting gently on her belly, reviewing the messages and recordings she had meticulously gathered. Sabrina appeared almost out of nowhere, her presence explosive and deliberate. She leaned against the wall, glaring at Ava, her voice dripping with venom as she raised it enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You think you can have him, you think you can live your perfect little life, don't you?" she sneered. Other patients and staff turned their heads, uncomfortable with the intensity, but Sabrina thrived on the attention. Ava's heart raced, but she kept her composure, gripping her phone to capture the encounter, knowing that every word could be vital evidence later. After the confrontation, Ava was summoned by her doctor, who spoke with urgency. "Ava, I need you to understand, stress at this level can be extremely dangerous for both you and the baby. You need to avoid these encounters whenever possible, and if harassment continues, we may need to take more serious protective measures." The words, though calm, reverberated in Ava's mind like a warning bell. Meanwhile, Sabrina's behavior became more erratic. Paranoia crept in, twisting her once sharp instincts into frantic overreactions. Every message Ava sent, every move she made, was perceived as a calculated trap, a threat to her fragile sense of control. She began pacing, obsessively checking her phone, imagining consequences everywhere. The line between offense and defense blurred, and her aggression escalated even further, fueled by fear and insecurity. What had started as jealousy had mutated into chaos. And as the paranoia tightened its grip, it became clear that Sabrina Hayes was a woman spiraling, dangerously untethered, with her next move unpredictable and terrifying. Ava sat at the small dining table in her apartment, the folder in front of her seeming to weigh more than the entire room. Every recording, every message, every photograph of Sabrina Hayes' harassment, meticulously collected over the past weeks, was carefully organized and labeled. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for the arrival of attorney Claire Donovan, a woman reputed for her sharp mind and unwavering resolve in high-profile cases. When Claire arrived, her presence was commanding yet calm, radiating competence that immediately put Ava at ease. "I've reviewed the situation briefly," Claire said, settling into the chair opposite Ava, "but I want to see everything you've collected. Every detail matters." Ava took a deep breath and began handing over the folder, each piece of evidence a small but powerful testament to the harassment, threats, and manipulation she had endured. From screenshots of late-night messages to the videos secretly recorded at the clinic, every item was a brick in the foundation of her case. She explained each encounter, each subtle threat, and the escalating patterns of aggression that had become impossible to ignore. Claire listened intently, occasionally making notes, asking precise questions that encouraged Ava to clarify details that could strengthen her position in court. With every response, Ava felt a small but growing sense of empowerment. She realized that this wasn't just about filing a complaint anymore, this was about reclaiming control, about proving that she would not be silenced, intimidated, or erased. Claire's confidence in the evidence, and in Ava herself, was contagious. By the time their meeting ended, Claire had already begun drafting a strategy, outlining a case so solid that Sabrina Hayes' wealth, privilege, and influence could not diminish its impact. She assured Ava that the law could protect her and her unborn child, and that the truth would prevail. For the first time in weeks, Ava felt a sense of clarity and strength. The fear that had tightened around her chest began to loosen, replaced by determination and resolve. She was no longer a passive victim of circumstance. With Claire's guidance and the evidence she had painstakingly gathered, Ava transformed from frightened to fearless. Each step she took from that day forward was deliberate, intentional, and unyielding, an unwavering march toward justice that no one, not even Sabrina Hayes, could derail. The courthouse was buzzing with energy, a palpable tension threading through every corridor, every seat, every whispered conversation. Reporters, cameras, and microphones crowded the lobby, eager to capture every moment of the high-profile case that had gripped the city. The harassment of a pregnant woman by the police commissioner's daughter was sensational news, and Ava Collins' courage in coming forward had turned her into the center of a storm. Inside the courtroom, spectators murmured, some sympathetic, others curious, all aware that the events about to unfold could make headlines for weeks. Sabrina Hayes entered first, her posture rigid, face composed, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to power. Her father, Commissioner Richard Hayes, followed close behind, the weight of his presence giving her an aura of untouchability. The courtroom seemed to shift as they settled into their seats, a subtle reminder of the influence she wielded. Yet, beneath that composed exterior, Ava sensed tension, the cracks of insecurity beginning to show in brief glances, flickers of doubt, and tightly pressed lips. When Ava's turn came, she stood with attorney Claire Donovan by her side. Claire methodically presented the evidence, the recordings of harassment, threatening messages, videos of confrontations, and meticulously organized documentation of every incident. The effect was immediate. Gasps echoed through the room as the judge, jury, and even spectators absorbed the undeniable proof of Sabrina's obsessive and aggressive behavior. The meticulously collected evidence left little room for doubt, each piece reinforcing the narrative of intimidation, danger, and emotional torment inflicted upon Ava. Witnesses took the stand one by one, neighbors who had seen Sabrina loitering near Ava's apartment, clinic staff who had witnessed public confrontations, and even colleagues who testified about Ethan's secret dealings and complicity. Each account chipped away at the facade of power Sabrina had tried to maintain, painting a comprehensive picture of harassment, obsession, and manipulation. Even Ethan's own words and actions were scrutinized, his complicity now publicly exposed. By the end of the day, the courtroom was filled with a stunned silence. The media outside could hardly believe the extent of the evidence. Ava, once frightened and cornered, now stood tall, a beacon of resilience. The courtroom had trembled under the weight of the truth, and for the first time, it was clear, justice, evidence, and courage could overpower privilege and intimidation. Ethan Collins had always imagined himself untouchable, protected by status, charm, and the manipulations that had allowed him to conceal the truth from everyone, including Ava. But as the courtroom proceedings unfolded, the reality of his choices came crashing down. His lies, once carefully woven to maintain appearances, were now laid bare for everyone to see. Text messages, bank statements, and recordings presented by Ava and Claire left no room for denial. His secret affairs, his financial dependence on Sabrina Hayes, and his active complicity in her harassment of his pregnant wife were exposed in front of the judge, the jury, and a courtroom packed with spectators. The humiliation was immediate, sharp, and inescapable. Even outside the courtroom, the news spread like wildfire. Reporters detailed every sordid revelation, turning Ethan into the public face of betrayal, deceit, and weakness. Former colleagues began distancing themselves, hesitant to be associated with a man whose professional and personal ethics had collapsed so thoroughly. Friends who had once offered support now treated him with cautious sympathy, often tinged with judgment. And as the media frenzy grew, the magnitude of his isolation became apparent. Ethan's carefully constructed world was crumbling, piece by piece. Sabrina, reveling in her own vindication, seized the moment to expose the financial dependency that had tethered Ethan to her. Her testimony revealed loans, payments, and favors he had accepted, showing that his complicity had not been born solely out of weakness, but out of a reliance that made him subservient to her whims. He had allowed fear and desire to dictate his actions, enabling Sabrina's cruelty toward Ava, and now it was all public. Alone in his apartment that evening, Ethan stared at the phone in disbelief, realizing he had lost everything: his reputation, his career, his social standing, and most painfully, the trust and love of his wife. The arrogance and selfishness that had guided his decisions now seemed like an irreparable mistake. He understood, painfully and vividly, that he had destroyed his life by betraying Ava. Each choice he had made, each compromise, had led him here, leaving him not only humiliated but profoundly aware of the emptiness of his triumphs. In the end, it wasn't Sabrina's wrath that broke him, it was the weight of his own betrayal, a truth he could no longer deny. The courtroom erupted in quiet astonishment as the verdicts were read. Sabrina Hayes, once untouchable in her own mind, was formally charged with harassment, vandalism, and endangerment. The evidence Ava Collins had painstakingly gathered, recordings, messages, eyewitness testimonies, was now the foundation of justice. Each charge represented a step toward reclaiming the life that had been threatened, a measure of accountability for the chaos Sabrina had unleashed. The spectators murmured among themselves, the reality sinking in that privilege and connections could not shield anyone from the consequences of their actions. Commissioner Richard Hayes, whose influence had once been absolute, now faced the weight of public scrutiny. His attempts to protect Sabrina had backfired spectacularly, exposing not only his daughter's misconduct but also his own complicity in enabling it. The pressure mounted, and within days, he was forced to resign. The resignation sent shockwaves through the community, the law enforcement world, and the media. For Ava, it was confirmation that courage and persistence could topple even the most intimidating walls of power. Ava's victory was more than symbolic. The court granted her custody and full legal protection, ensuring that both she and her unborn child were safe from further harassment or threats. Every detail of the judgment reinforced her right to live free from fear, and every order issued was a shield for her and her baby's future. What had begun as intimidation and aggression had ended in vindication and security. As she left the courtroom, Claire Donovan placed a firm hand on Ava's shoulder, eyes bright with admiration. "You are extraordinary," she said. "Your courage, your patience, and your determination are what made this possible. You refused to be silenced, and you stood your ground when it mattered most. You've shown what it means to fight with strength and dignity." Ava felt a surge of relief and empowerment, a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized had been crushing her. The path had been long, frightening, and exhausting, but she had walked it with unwavering resolve. In that moment, She knew that the victory was not just legal, it was personal, a reclamation of control, safety, and self-respect. Sabrina Hayes and her influence no longer held power over Ava's life. She had won, and the courage that had carried her this far would continue to guide her and her child into a secure, promising future. Months had passed since the courtroom battle ended, and Ava Collins finally felt the quiet of a life she could call her own. The relentless fear, the constant anxiety, and the sleepless nights were slowly giving way to mornings filled with gentle sunlight and the soft coos of her newborn daughter. Each day, she watched the little life she had carried so fiercely grow, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose and strength blossomed within her. The shadows of harassment and betrayal that had once haunted her seemed to fade further with every smile, every tiny grasp of her daughter's hand, reminding Ava that she had survived, and more importantly, she had triumphed. She drove through the city streets one crisp morning in a sleek new car, its pristine paint gleaming in the sun. To anyone else, it might have seemed just another vehicle, but for Ava, it was far more than that. It was a symbol of resilience, of control regained, of the life she had painstakingly rebuilt. The car represented freedom, freedom from fear, from manipulation, and from a husband and a mistress who had once sought to dominate her existence. As she navigated familiar streets, she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that every mile she drove was hers entirely, no one could intimidate her, and the memories of the chaos that had surrounded her were now merely reminders of the strength she had discovered within herself. Ethan Collins and Sabrina Hayes had disappeared from the public eye, their once powerful presences reduced to whispers and headlines long forgotten. The chaos they had tried to create had not survived the light of truth and the force of Ava's courage. Ava no longer carried the burden of their threats or the shadow of their control. Her life, while quieter, was richer, fuller, and anchored in the knowledge that she had faced danger and deception and emerged unbroken. As she parked outside her daughter's daycare, the little girl's giggle reaching her ears, Ava took a deep breath, feeling the wind on her face. She whispered to herself, a soft yet unwavering declaration, "They shattered my car, but not my courage, because from those broken pieces, I rebuilt a life no one can ever break again." And in that moment, the past finally felt like a chapter closed, replaced by a future filled with hope, safety, and the unshakable strength of a mother who refused to be defeated.